Just a few weeks ago, something happened at Chipotle that still makes me uneasy whenever I think about it. I've always been a creature of habit, especially when it comes to food. Chipotle is my go-to spot after work. I know exactly what I like, and I order the same thing almost every time. It's a simple routine that helps me wind down after a long day. Place the order on the app, drive over, grab the bag from the pickup shelf, and head home. It's always been easy and predictable, until that night. It had been a typical day at work, nothing out of the ordinary. On my way home, I placed my usual Chipotle order, eager to get some food and relax. By the time I pulled into the parking lot, the app showed that my order was ready. I parked the car and walked inside, expecting the same quick and seamless experience I'd had dozens of times before. The restaurant wasn't too busy. A few people sat at tables eating or waiting for their orders. The familiar smells of grilled meat and spices filled the air, and the background noise of soft chatter and employees calling out orders made the place feel lively but calm. As I approached the pickup shelf, I noticed him immediately. A larger man with glasses and a mostly shaved head standing directly in front of the shelf. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe he was waiting for his own order, or maybe he was double-checking something. The shelf wasn't crowded and there was only one bag sitting there, mine. I figured he'd move once he saw me coming. "Excuse me," I said as I approached. "I just need to grab my order." The man turned his head and looked at me. He didn't move. For a moment I thought he hadn't heard me. I gestured to the bag on the shelf. "That's my order right there," I said, keeping my voice polite. "Do you mind if I grab it?" He didn't respond. Instead, he just stared at me, his expression annoyed, almost irritated. The silence stretched for a few uncomfortable seconds. I wasn't sure what to do. Normally, people are quick to step aside in situations like this, but this guy didn't budge. He just stood there, blocking the shelf completely. Could you move for a second?" I asked, my voice a little firmer this time. The man's expression darkened. "Actually, I do mind," he said flatly. His response caught me off guard. Why would he care if I grabbed my own order? For a moment I thought he might be joking, but his tone and body language made it clear he wasn't. "Okay, can you just hand it to me then?" I asked, trying to keep things civil. "No," he said bluntly. I blinked, unsure of how to handle the situation. My patience was wearing thin, but I didn't want to escalate things. After all, I was just here to grab dinner, not get into a confrontation. I decided to try another approach. Moving carefully, I attempted to step around him, reaching for the bag without actually touching him. But as soon as I got close, he shifted deliberately, bumping into me and cutting me off. "Seriously?" I said, taking a step back. The man didn't respond. He just stood there like a wall, staring straight ahead, his body firmly planted in front of the shelf. At this point, I was both confused and frustrated. I figured maybe he was waiting for his own order and would eventually move once he got it. So I stepped back and decided to wait him out. Minutes passed. The restaurant wasn't particularly busy, and the employees behind the counter didn't seem to be preparing any new orders for him. The man just stood there, motionless, not talking to anyone or checking his phone. Nothing. I started to wonder if he had even ordered anything at all. His behavior didn't make any sense. Why would someone come to Chipotle just to block the pickup shelf? I glanced around, hoping someone else might step in or at least notice what was happening. But the other customers were absorbed in their meals. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. He seemed distracted for a moment, his attention shifting slightly. Seizing the opportunity, I quietly stepped closer, positioned myself behind him, and quickly grabbed the bag off the shelf. As soon as I had it in my hands, the man moved. He stepped back suddenly, slamming into me with his full weight. The impact nearly knocked me over, but I managed to steady myself. My heart was racing, but I didn't let it show. Clutching the bag tightly, I turned and walked briskly toward the exit. "Excuse me," the man shouted behind me. I didn't stop. I pushed the door open and stepped outside, hoping that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. I heard the door slam behind me, and when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw him following me. My pulse quickened as I walked faster toward my car. The parking lot suddenly felt too empty, the distance to my car too far. I reached my car, opened the driver's side door, and got in quickly. Before I could shut the door, the man was there. He planted himself in the doorframe, preventing me from closing it. "What's your problem?" I asked, my voice sharp with frustration and a hint of fear. The man didn't answer. Instead, he cursed at me, his voice loud and angry. His words blurred together in a stream of profanity, but his hostility was unmistakable. "Move," I said, trying to stay calm but firm. He didn't budge. For nearly a full minute, he stood there, shouting and blocking my door. Then, out of nowhere, he kicked the side of my car, hard. The sound echoed in the quiet parking lot and my stomach lurched. Finally, as if he'd gotten whatever satisfaction he was looking for, he stepped back and walked away. Shaken, I slammed the door shut, locked it, and started the engine. My hands were trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. I watched him disappear into the night, then drove off as fast as I could. I didn't go back to that Chipotle for weeks. The thought of running into him again was too much. I couldn't understand why he had acted that way, what his motive was or what he hoped to achieve. Was he just trying to intimidate me? Or was there something deeper, something more dangerous about him? Even now, the memory lingers. Every time I walk into a Chipotle, I can't help but glance at the pickup shelf, half expecting to see him standing there, blocking the way, daring me to approach. It's a reminder that even the most mundane routines can take a dark and unexpected turn. Several years ago, I worked at a Chipotle for a few months. It wasn't a long stint, just enough to get some work experience under my belt and earn a little money. The job itself was pretty straightforward, and while it wasn't something I wanted to do forever, it gave me a weird sort of pride. I'd wear the uniform and go through the motions of making burritos and bowls, chatting with customers, and managing the lunch rush. Even after I left, I couldn't help but love the food. There was something comforting about it, like it connected me to a simpler time in my life when things were predictable. Even though I'd worked at a Chipotle, I rarely went back to the one where I used to work. It wasn't that I had bad memories there, I just didn't want to run into old coworkers and deal with awkward small talk. Instead, I'd frequent other locations, ones where I could slip in, order my food, and leave without a second thought. But one night, that routine was upended in a way I'll never forget. It was late, probably around 9:15 p.m., and I was driving home after a long day out. My stomach growled as I realized I hadn't eaten since lunch, and I started scanning the roadside for places to grab food. That's when I saw the familiar sign, Chipotle, glowing faintly under the fluorescent parking lot lights. My mouth watered at the thought of a burrito bowl piled high with rice, beans, and guacamole. Without hesitation, I turned into the parking lot. The lot was nearly empty, save for a few scattered cars. I parked close to the entrance, grabbed my wallet, and hopped out of the car. The air was cool, and the pavement still radiated a faint warmth from the day's sun. I didn't think to check if the place was open. Chipotle was always open until 10 p.m., wasn't it? I walked briskly to the door, already deciding what I'd order. But as I reached for the handle, I realized something was off. The lights inside were dim, the chairs were stacked on tables, and the open sign was dark. They were closed. I stood there for a moment, confused. I was so sure they stayed open later. Why were they closed? As I glanced around the darkened interior, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Turning, I saw a woman sitting on the sidewalk, leaning against the building. She was wearing a Chipotle uniform, black shirt, visor, the whole thing. "Hi," she called out, her voice tired but friendly. "Hey," I replied, taking a few cautious steps toward her. "Did you guys close early?" "Yeah," she said, letting out a small sigh. "We had to close at 9 o'clock tonight, short staff." I nodded, disappointed but understanding. "That sucks. I thought you were open until 10. She shrugged, her posture slouched as if she'd been waiting there a while. "It happens." Then, after a brief pause, she added, "Hey, can I ask you a favor?" I froze, caught off guard. Sure. What is it? I'm kind of stranded here, she said. My ride didn't show up, and I need to get to a gas station. Do you think you could give me a lift? I hesitated, my mind racing. On one hand, she seemed genuine, just an employee stuck after a long shift. I remembered how draining those closing shifts could be, especially when you had no way to get home. On the other hand, a small voice in the back of my head whispered caution. I didn't know her, and letting a stranger into my car wasn't exactly something I did often. Still, there was something disarming about her demeanor. She seemed harmless, and I couldn't shake the sense of camaraderie I felt seeing her in that uniform. Maybe it was because I used to work at Chipotle myself, or maybe it was just because I didn't want to leave her stranded. Sure, I said finally. I can take you. Her face lit up with relief. Thank you, she said, standing up and brushing off her pants. We walked to my car together, and as she climbed into the passenger seat, I asked, "Where are you headed?" She named a gas station I didn't recognize, then added, "My friend is supposed to meet me there." I frowned slightly. "I don't know where that is." "That's okay," she said. "It's close by. I'll tell you where to go." I started the car, and she began giving me directions. At first, the route seemed normal enough. We passed a few other businesses and well-lit streets, but after a couple of turns, things started to change. The streets became darker, quieter. The bright storefronts gave way to stretches of empty lots and overgrown grass. "Are you sure it's around here?" I asked, glancing over at her. "Yeah," she said calmly. "Just keep going." There was something in her tone that made me uneasy. It wasn't nervous or apologetic. It was steady, almost too steady, like she was completely at ease despite the increasingly desolate surroundings. Finally, she told me to turn into a parking lot. I pulled in and immediately felt my stomach drop. The gas station was abandoned. The building was dark, its windows boarded up and smeared with dirt. The lot was cracked and uneven with weeds sprouting through the asphalt. It didn't just look closed, it looked like it hadn't been open for years. There were no other cars, no lights, no signs of life. "This is it?" I asked, my voice tinged with disbelief. "Yeah," she said. I stared at her, my unease growing by the second. "It's closed, completely abandoned." She glanced at the building, then back at me. "Let me just go check." I shook my head, my pulse quickening. "There's nothing to check. It's obvious no one's here." She hesitated, then said, "Can you come with me? Just in case?" The suggestion sent a chill down my spine. Why would I need to go with her? What was there to check? Everything about the situation screamed danger. "No," I said firmly. "I'm not getting out of the car." Her expression shifted, just for a moment. It was subtle, a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. Frustration, disappointment. Whatever it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Okay," she said, her voice calm again. "Can you take me to another gas station then?" I nodded, already putting the car in reverse. "Yeah, I'll take you to the next one." The drive to the next gas station was tense. Neither of us spoke, and the silence felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on me. I kept glancing at her out of the corner of my eye, trying to read her expression, but she was staring straight ahead, her face unreadable. When we reached the next gas station, a brightly lit, bustling one, I pulled into the lot and stopped the car. "Here you go," I said, forcing a smile. "Thanks," she said, opening the door. She got out without another word, walking toward the building. I watched her until she disappeared inside, then drove away, my heart still pounding. As I made my way home, the questions started swirling in my mind. Why had she wanted to go to an abandoned gas station? Was she really stranded? Or was she trying to lure me into something? What would have happened if I'd gotten out of the car with her? Or worse, if I'd waited there for her? The possibilities made my stomach churn. Even now, years later, I can't shake the memory of that night. It was a stark reminder that not everyone is as they seem, and sometimes trusting your instincts can be the difference between safety and danger. I'm just grateful I didn't let curiosity or kindness lead me into a situation I couldn't get out of. A couple of years ago, I had one of the strangest and most unsettling experiences of my life, and to this day, I can't fully explain it. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm in public spaces, and it reminds me of how fragile the sense of safety can be. It started as a completely normal day, just hanging out with my friend Jordan, enjoying the simplicity of being young, carefree, and out of school for the weekend. Jordan and I had been friends for years. He was the kind of person who could make anything fun with his sharp wit and endless stream of jokes. We often spent our free time wandering around shopping centers, going into random stores and finding excuses to laugh at anything and everything. That day was no different. We'd been at a shopping plaza not far from my house, killing time in a few stores, and eventually, hunger hit us like a brick wall. "Man, I'm starving," Jordan said, rubbing his stomach dramatically as we walked out of a sporting goods store. "Same," I said, looking around the plaza. It was one of those sprawling places filled with chain restaurants, boutiques, and the occasional mom-and-pop shop. Across the parking lot, I spotted the familiar brown and green sign of Chipotle. "What about that?" Jordan perked up immediately. "Perfect, let's do it." We crossed the parking lot, the smell of grilled meat and spices wafting out as we approached. The line inside wasn't too bad, typical for a weekend evening, but the place was lively. Families, groups of teenagers, and a few solo diners filled the tables, their voices mingling with the clatter of dishes and employees calling out orders. It was the kind of busy that felt reassuring, like being surrounded by people would ward off anything bad. We got our food quickly, burrito bowls for both of us, and found a table near the front of the restaurant, close to the windows. I liked the spot because it gave me a view of the parking lot, which was bathed in the soft glow of streetlights as the sun began to set. Jordan and I dug into our food, the conversation flowing effortlessly. We joked about the weird items we'd seen in the sporting goods store, talked about upcoming plans, and made fun of each other's burrito bowl choices. It was the kind of easy camaraderie that made the chaos of the restaurant fade into the background. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was such a small thing, but it broke the rhythm of the moment. I instinctively pulled my phone out, figuring it was a notification or a message from one of my family members. But when I unlocked the screen, I froze. The text was from a number I didn't recognize. "I'm in Chipotle with you, and I'm watching you right now." I stared at the message, the words blurring slightly as my mind raced to process them. My first thought was that it had to be a joke. Maybe it was a friend who'd seen me here and was trying to mess with me. I laughed nervously and showed the text to Jordan. "Look at this," I said, handing him my phone. He read the message and immediately snorted. "Dude, it's gotta be someone we know. Maybe Chris or Mike? You know how they are. Always pulling this kind of crap." I nodded, wanting to believe him. "Yeah, probably. They've done stuff like this before." Still, something about it didn't sit right with me. I glanced around the restaurant, scanning the faces of the diners for anyone I recognized. Most people were absorbed in their food or their conversations, but then my eyes landed on a man sitting in the far corner of the restaurant. He wasn't eating. He wasn't talking. He was staring right at me. The moment our eyes met, he raised his hand and waved. It wasn't a friendly wave. It was slow and deliberate, like he wanted me to know that he'd been watching me. My stomach dropped. Jordan," I said, nudging him and nodding toward the corner. "That guy just waved at me." Jordan turned around, following my gaze. His playful demeanor shifted instantly. "You know him?" "No," I said, shaking my head. "I've never seen him before. And how would he even get my number?" Jordan frowned. "That's weird, really weird." I decided to text the number back, needing answers. "Who is this?" I typed, my fingers trembling slightly. The reply came almost immediately. "Never mind who I am. I know who I am. Do you know who you are?" The cryptic response sent a chill down my spine. It didn't make any sense, but the strangeness of it only added to my growing unease. I showed the text to Jordan, and his frown deepened. "What does that even mean?" he asked. "I have no idea," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I looked back at the man. He was still staring, his expression blank and unchanging. It felt like he was daring me to do something, to react in some way. I couldn't take it anymore. I blocked the number, hoping that would be the end of it. "Let's just eat and leave," I said, trying to sound calm. "This guy's just some weirdo trying to freak me out." Jordan nodded, but the tension was palpable. We tried to return to our conversation, but it was hard to focus. I felt like I was being watched the entire time, and every now and then, I'd glance at the man out of the corner of my eye. He hadn't moved. Eventually, though, he did. I noticed him stand up out of the corner of my eye. My heart rate spiked as he started walking toward us. "Jordan," I whispered, nudging him. "I see him," he said, his voice low and tense. The man didn't approach our table directly. Instead, he stopped at the table next to ours and sat down. He positioned himself so he was facing us, his unblinking gaze fixed on me. "What the hell is this guy doing?" Jordan muttered. I swallowed hard and turned to the man. "Hey, what's your problem?" I asked, my voice firmer than I felt. He didn't answer. He just stared, his silence more unsettling than any words could have been. "Seriously, what do you want?" I asked again, my voice rising slightly. Finally, he raised his hand, palm out, like he was signaling me to wait. For a moment, it looked like he was going to say something. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Then, without warning, he stood up, turned, and walked away. Jordan and I sat there in stunned silence, watching as he strode toward the door. He didn't look back, didn't acknowledge us. He just left. I kept my eyes on him until he disappeared into the parking lot. "What the hell just happened?" Jordan said finally, his voice filled with disbelief. "I don't know," I said, shaking my head. My hands were trembling and I felt like I couldn't catch my breath. "I don't know who he was or how he got my number, but that was creepy as hell," Jordan finished. We stayed in the restaurant for a little while longer, both of us too shaken to leave immediately. When we finally did, we made sure to look around the parking lot, scanning for any sign of the man. Thankfully, he was nowhere to be seen. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the incident. The man's cryptic text messages, his unsettling stare, the way he moved and acted. It all felt like something out of a nightmare. I double-checked the locks on my doors and even peeked out the windows a few times before going to bed, half expecting him to be standing outside. To this day, I still don't know who he was, how he got my number, or what he wanted. But the experience left me with a lingering sense of unease. It was a reminder that even in the most ordinary places surrounded by people, you can never be completely sure who's watching or why. When I was 17, I got my first real job at Chipotle. It felt like a rite of passage stepping into the adult world of responsibility while still navigating the chaos of high school. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was perfect for me. The Chipotle where I worked was less than a mile from my house, making it easy for me to walk to and from work, even though I didn't yet have a car. I lived with my parents and younger brother in a quiet neighborhood tucked behind the shopping center where the restaurant was located. I'd walk past the Starbucks, a couple of other shops, and cross the street before entering the parking lot that led to the restaurant. It was a familiar route, one I could traverse blindfolded. At that time, walking gave me a sense of independence. I liked the routine of it, the way the sun would set as I walked to work in the afternoons, or how the quiet of the neighborhood wrapped around me when I walked home at night. I never worried much about safety. It felt like my little corner of the world was insulated from the dangers I heard about on the news. But all that changed one evening during a shift I'll never forget. It started like any other day. I'd come home from school, changed into my uniform, and left for work around 3:30 p.m. The walk was uneventful. The streets calm except for the occasional passing car. I arrived at Chipotle, clocked in, and joined the team behind the counter, assembling burritos and bowls for the steady flow of customers. There's a rhythm to that kind of work. Taking orders, asking questions, moving quickly to keep the line moving. I liked how the routine kept me busy and made the hours pass quickly. That day, we were fairly busy. The after-school crowd had come and gone, replaced by families and office workers grabbing dinner. I barely noticed individual faces unless there was something unusual about them, or they struck up a conversation. That's why I didn't think much about the man who came through the line sometime in the early evening. He was unremarkable, average height, a neatly trimmed beard, wearing a gray hoodie and jeans. When he reached me at the counter, he seemed polite enough but not particularly friendly. He ordered a bowl, listing off ingredients in a monotone voice. I moved mechanically, grabbing each item as he spoke. It was all routine until we reached the end of the line. Out of nowhere, he asked, "What time do you get off work?" The question startled me. It wasn't framed as small talk or part of a casual conversation. It was abrupt, almost clinical. My hand froze as I looked up at him. I felt a flicker of discomfort, but I didn't want to overthink it. Maybe he was just curious for some strange reason. 9, I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. I didn't feel the need to lie. I didn't think he'd do anything with the information. He nodded, giving a brief okay before paying for his food and moving to a table. I shook off the interaction and turned to help the next customer, pushing the brief unease out of my mind. People ask odd questions sometimes, I told myself. It didn't have to mean anything. For the next hour, I focused on my work, keeping the line moving and chatting with coworkers during the occasional lull. At some point, I glanced around the dining area, and my eyes landed on the man from earlier. He was still there, sitting alone in a corner table, his bowl long empty. He was staring at his phone, scrolling occasionally, but he wasn't eating or doing anything else. I remember thinking it was a little odd that he hadn't left yet, but I didn't dwell on it. Customers linger all the time, catching up on work, waiting for friends, or simply enjoying a quiet moment. Still, something about the way he sat there, not engaging with anyone or anything around him, stuck in my mind. As the hours ticked by, I noticed him again. It was nearly 8 p.m., and he was still there. By then, the dining room had mostly cleared out, with only a few stragglers finishing their meals. I kept glancing at him, hoping he'd leave before my shift ended. A part of me couldn't help but remember his earlier question. Was he waiting for me? The thought made my stomach churn. I didn't say anything to my coworkers. I didn't want to sound paranoid, especially since the man wasn't doing anything overtly threatening. But as the minutes crept closer to 9 p.m., I couldn't shake the growing unease. I'd glance up from the counter and see him in the same spot, sitting motionless except for the occasional flick of his finger on his phone screen. Finally, 9 o'clock came, and my shift ended. I clocked out, grabbed my things, and prepared to leave. I hoped that by some miracle he'd left while I wasn't paying attention, but as I walked past the dining area toward the door, I saw him still sitting there. His head turned slightly, following me as I walked out. My heart raced, but I kept my pace steady, not wanting to show any fear. Once outside, I hurried down the sidewalk, past Starbucks, and toward the quieter residential street that led to my neighborhood. The night air was cool, and the streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement. I tried to calm myself, convincing myself that the man was probably still inside the restaurant. Maybe he wasn't following me. Maybe I was overreacting. Then I heard the footsteps. They were faint at first, just the soft crunch of shoes on gravel behind me. My breath hitched as I glanced over my shoulder. There he was, about 50 feet back, walking in the same direction. My pulse quickened as I turned back around, forcing myself to keep moving. It couldn't be a coincidence. There was no reason for him to be on this street unless he was following me. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. The houses around me were dark and quiet, the windows lifeless. I didn't feel safe leading him to my house where my family was. My mind raced, searching for a solution. Then I remembered my phone. My hands trembled as I pulled it from my pocket and dialed my dad's number. He answered quickly, his voice steady and reassuring. "What's wrong?" "There's a guy following me home," I whispered, glancing back again. The man was still there, his pace matching mine, but he hadn't gotten any closer. He was at Chipotle, and now he's on my street. My dad's tone shifted, becoming firm and protective. "Stay where you are. I'm coming to get you." I felt a small wave of relief but didn't stop walking. There's something comforting about routines. They anchor you in a sense of normalcy. And for me, one of those routines was grabbing Chipotle on my way home after a long day of work. It wasn't extravagant, but there was a satisfaction in walking into the restaurant, watching the line move efficiently, and leaving with a burrito bowl in hand. The Chipotle near my apartment was less than 10 minutes away, and their staff was always quick. It was the perfect convenience. But one night, that comfort was shaken, and my sense of safety was disrupted in a way I'll never forget. It started innocently enough. That night, I was exhausted. Work had dragged on longer than usual, and I didn't feel like driving anywhere, even for my usual Chipotle. As I sat on my couch scrolling through my phone, the Chipotle app caught my eye. I'd used it before to check the menu, but that evening, a bold notification at the top of the screen grabbed my attention. Free delivery for a limited time. It felt like a sign. Why go out when I could have my meal brought to me for free? It seemed like a small luxury. I placed my order, a burrito bowl, chips, and guac, and paid through the app. The estimated delivery time wasn't too bad. Just enough for me to hop in the shower, clean up, and relax before digging in. I hit place order, tossed my phone onto the coffee table, and headed to the bathroom. The warm water washed away the day's stress. As I was drying off, I heard it, a sharp knock at my door. The sound startled me, echoing in the quiet apartment. I wasn't expecting anyone else, so it had to be the delivery. Perfect timing, I thought. Throwing on some clothes, I hurried to the door. But when I opened it, the hallway was empty. Confusion set in. I stepped out, looking up and down the corridor, but there was no one. Not even a delivery bag on the floor. My brows furrowed as I turned back inside and grabbed my phone. Checking the app, I confirmed what I already suspected. The order was marked as delivered. But where was it? Pacing, I tried to make sense of it. Maybe the delivery person had left it at the wrong door. It didn't make sense, though. I'd heard the knock. Frustration bubbled up as another thought crossed my mind. Someone could have taken it. The idea made me uneasy. I lived in an apartment building with multiple units on each floor, and while I didn't know everyone personally, the few neighbors I'd interacted with seemed decent enough. Still, the possibility nagged at me. Reluctantly, I called Chipotle. Explaining the situation felt awkward. I didn't want to sound like I was accusing anyone outright. Thankfully, the employee on the phone was understanding. After a brief conversation, they agreed to send a replacement order. This time, I wasn't taking any chances. I stood by the door, phone in hand, waiting for the delivery notification. When the second knock finally came, I opened the door almost immediately. There it was, my food, untouched. I grabbed it and brought it inside, but the unease lingered. The next morning, I left my apartment to head to work. As I locked my door, something on the surface caught my eye. A piece of paper was taped there, fluttering slightly in the drafty hallway. I peeled it off and my stomach dropped as I read the hastily scrawled words, "Thanks for the Chipotle last night." A crude, mocking, smiley face was drawn beneath the message. My heart raced. Whoever had taken my food wasn't just a thief, they were taunting me. The breezy tone of the note sent a chill through me. It was one thing for someone to grab a bag of free food and move on, but this felt personal, intrusive. I crumpled the note in my fist and shoved it into my bag, my mind racing with questions. Who had done this, and why? Throughout the day, I couldn't concentrate. I replayed the events over and over in my mind. Was it someone who lived on my floor? Someone who had seen the bag, grabbed it, and decided to make a game of it? What was worse, I realized, was that they knew where I lived. They'd come back to leave the note, rubbing salt in the wound. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. By the time I got home that evening, I'd mostly convinced myself it was an isolated incident. I told myself the person probably thought it was a joke and wouldn't do it again. I cooked dinner instead of ordering out, unwilling to take the risk. The next morning, however, my fragile sense of security was shattered. Another note was taped to my door. This one read, "No food for me last night." The mocking tone hit me like a slap. They weren't just teasing me, they were keeping tabs on me, watching what I did. I ripped the note down and stormed back inside, pacing. This wasn't just annoying anymore. It was invasive. I checked the locks on my door, even sliding a chair under the handle for extra measure. My apartment didn't have security cameras in the hallways, and there was no easy way to find out who was doing this without going door to door, a move I wasn't prepared to make. I resolved to stay vigilant and hope it would stop, but it didn't. The following night, the knocking came again. This time I was sitting in the kitchen scrolling through my phone. The sound startled me, a loud and deliberate series of knocks echoing through the quiet. My heart leapt as I stood, pulse quickening. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole, but no one was there. Acting on instinct, I flung the door open, catching the faint sound of hurried footsteps down the hallway. I stepped out, just in time to see a figure disappearing around the corner. Adrenaline coursed through me as I followed. I wasn't sure what I would do if I caught them, but I couldn't let them get away again. The figure entered the stairwell, and I trailed behind at a safe distance, careful not to make noise. They climbed one flight of stairs and disappeared into an apartment on the floor above mine. I hesitated at the door. My anger was boiling over, but the idea of confronting someone I didn't know in their own space made me nervous. Taking a deep breath, I knocked. At first, there was no response, and I considered leaving. Then the door opened, revealing a woman I vaguely recognized from the building. Her expression was a mix of annoyance and confusion. "What is it?" she asked. I explained what had been happening, describing the man I'd seen. She frowned. "That's my boyfriend," she said reluctantly. "He's staying here for a few days." At that moment, the man appeared behind her. My stomach flipped as I recognized him, the figure from the hallway. When I accused him of stealing my food and leaving the notes, his face twisted into a smirk. "You're crazy," he said, laughing dismissively. But the woman's face shifted to concern. "Wait," she said, turning to him. "Didn't you have Chipotle the other night?" His smirk faltered, and the two began arguing. As their voices rose, I stepped back, not wanting to get involved in their domestic dispute. I returned to my apartment, relieved but shaken. At least I knew who was behind it. I hoped the confrontation would put an end to the harassment, but it didn't. About 15 minutes later, a loud banging on my door shattered the quiet. It wasn't knocking this time, it was pounding, heavy and furious. My heart leapt into my throat as I looked through the peephole. The man was back, his face contorted with rage. He was hitting the door so hard it rattled on its hinges. "I'm calling the cops," I shouted, but he didn't stop. He began kicking the door, the sound reverberating through the hallway. My hands shook as I dialed 911, stammering out the situation to the dispatcher. The minutes dragged on like hours as the man continued his assault, shouting incoherently from the other side of the door. Finally, the pounding stopped. I heard him storm off, and moments later the police arrived. I told them everything, and they went to the woman's apartment to question him. But he was gone. The woman admitted she'd kicked him out after their argument, and he'd left the building. I later learned from a neighbor that the man had a history of anger issues and a troubled past. The woman ended their relationship, and I haven't seen him since. But the memory of that night lingers. Every knock at my door sends a chill through me, a haunting reminder of how quickly comfort can turn to terror.